Hey everyone, welcome. My name is Dane Sanders. I'll share more about me in just a minute, but first I just want to welcome you to the show. This is the people business at Common Thread Collective. And that is Orchid and I, have noticed that there's a lot of folks who pay a lot of attention to a lot of the geeky stuff around what we do around agency work, both here in the US and around the world. And we love that stuff. It's one of the reasons why we do what we do, but that's not all that we do. And it occurred to us as we were heading into this next year that we could probably make some other contributions that would be significant for others to consume, but also for us to process through out loud in a way that would be hopefully a gift, something that as you guys are thinking about the stuff that's important for you and your world, that this could open things up. But to get things started, let's do some introductions. Orchid is our Chief Operating Officer at Common Thread Collective. And Orchid, I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit of your background, what you got here, and why the heck you want to participate in this show.
Sure. Hi, Dane. Always a pleasure to see you. So my name is Orchid as Chief Operating, always, every single time. And at CTC, so I am responsible for day-to-day operations, overseeing our various business lines, growth strategy, paid media, creative strategy, retention, as well as our operations team. Been at CTC for a little over 2 years now. And prior to that, I have a background both brand side and agency side and a recovering consultant. So when Dane pitched me on this idea of a show we could do together to really talk about the ins and outs of what it means to be in the people business and things that, we find challenging, like goal setting, for instance, I was really excited because this was a conversation that I was just having casually with a lot of my friends. Thrilling, I know, but it sounded like a common denominator, especially among leadership, to tackle some of these questions. And I couldn't think of a better person to have these conversations with than Dane.
Thanks, Orchid. Very generous of you. My name is Dane, and I lead employee development and performance. And what that means is we help people get better. We help the organization get better as bringing people in well in terms of how we recruit and we enroll and we hire and we train and we retrain and we keep trying to set standards higher and higher. And we also pay a lot of attention to not just getting great people in, but taking existing people and inviting them to higher levels of contribution. And we care a lot about culture. That old line, culture eats strategy for breakfast, is something we think a lot about in terms of what kind of an environment are we creating where the people who really make this human services business tick, how do we set them up for success so that CTC is set up for success so that our clients are set up for success? Every level has to win. My background is a little eclectic, a little bit more kind of not just in this industry, but in a whole host of industries. And my main concern has been around how do humans thrive? Sometimes when people hear those kinds of ideas of like human flourishing, it can sound kind of woo-woo, and I get that. It gets even more woo-woo when you realize my grad work was in philosophy, Aristotelian virtue ethics, and it sounds kind of an odd pairing to take someone with those kinds of backgrounds, even though I have an undergrad in marketing, to apply that stuff around human flourishing in this context. But we actually think it's kind of strategic. It makes sense for us to be thinking about how do humans tick, and both internally, externally, how do we contribute in such a way or set an environment where people find their way forward, that they're voluntarily finding their way forward, especially if we're creating really high standards of operation. So how do we not discourage? How do we encourage? But also how do we attract really, really talented people who want to do fun and exciting work? So here we are. And today's conversation, we hope, is timely because we thought this time of year, most organizations are thinking about what's next, where are they going, how are we going to get there? And for today's episode, at least, my job is going to be to extract as much intelligence and wisdom out of Orchid as possible around the conversation of goal setting. And this, whether you call them OKRs or goals or KPI, it doesn't really matter for our purposes today. What matters is you've spent some energy looking at what just happened and you're thinking about what you want to happen next. In a sense, you have a snapshot of current reality and you have a vision for some preferred future that you aren't acting as an organization yet. And you want to get there. You want to deploy your people in such a way that they are crystal clear on what success equals and that we're doing it in a way where people are measured for that success and rewarded accordingly. So Orchid, to get things started, when you think about leading an organization like CTC and trying to get us from point A to point B, what is the first thing that comes to mind when it comes to goal setting?
I think that there's the general business goal that you're trying to achieve, right? You have the vision for the business. Is it going to be a growth year? Is it going to be a profitability year? Is it going to be a little bit of both? And the thing that comes top of mind for me is that goal is going to look different depending on which group you're talking to. And by group, I can mean business unit. So for the purposes of using CTC as the example, the paid social team their goals are going to look different from the growth strategy team. That's going to look different from the creative strategy team. So when we talk about goals that are different based on business unit, that's one group. Another group is an individual contributor versus a manager versus a director versus an executive. So you have the different levels as well. And I think that I've certainly been in environments where the company target was everybody's target. And I think that becomes a little confusing, especially at the individual contributor level, because, and I'll make a generalization here, you have people who are usually less experienced in those roles, maybe a little further away from a lot of the decision making that takes place. And so you can't allow, it's not that you can't allow, but you can't open it up and say, all right, here's our overall business goal, 10% top line growth. You interpret it for yourself, what that means based on what you're responsible for. Now, if an organization can clearly lay out what the job description is and what success looks like, maybe you can get away with that. But in my experience, the larger the organization, the more specific you have to be when it comes to how those goals and those individual goals, especially, relate and ladder up to the global business goal.
So what I'm hearing described is we have some very clear ambition at CTC for our organization as a whole, the result we want. But unless you take the time to think about the date or the place you're in the industry, the timing, are you a turnaround? Are you in growth mode? Are you in startup mode? All of those are going to contribute. But really what I'm hearing you focus on is, let's assume that you're a critical mass and you have a division of labor where you have management structures. It could be, C-suite, VPs, directors, managers, individual contributors. All of those are individual people who are kind of in different vicinities relative to the customer, different vicinities relative to or proximities to the projects that are at hand. And to have kind of here's the company goal, work it out, is probably not a really good strategy when it comes to getting the most out of your people. That we need to break it down a little bit more. And I wonder if we could start with, in that breaking it down, when you think about the hierarchy and the proximity of, you think about all those different roles managerially or leadership wise, and the need for whatever we do to make a significant impact on the customers that we serve. How do you begin to translate the company goal downstream?
I think it comes down to decision-making rights and purview. So let's say, and I know we're speaking specifically about our agency and being in the people services business. I think a lot of what we're talking about also applies to if you're a brand, right? Or if you're just a company selling products or widgets or whatever it might be. So when you start to break it down, so, at the highest level, let's say the CEO sets the vision and the ambition for the total business goal. The next level down, if you're looking at your executive team, is looking at how it applies to their specific business or their roles and responsibilities, especially their purview. So let's say, we have a goal from our CEO. I take it as an operational goal, which means that, my portion of that goal has to be efficient or encompass all the levers that I get to pull in order to hit that target. So we'll use a specific example. If it is a 10% top line revenue growth, let's say that is the goal for 2024, for argument's sake, then that top line revenue growth can come from existing customers or it can come from new customers. Now, I'm responsible for existing customers, whereas our VP of sales is responsible for new customers. So then I would take it level down from 10% top line growth to say, okay, well, I expect 60% to come from existing customers and 40% to come from new business. So now all of a sudden you've taken a business goal and started to break it down into relevant responsibility areas. And then let's take it another level down. So if it is, let's just again, make it super simple. Let's say $1 million for existing customers and growing those contracts or, growing that revenue. Then I can look across and see, all right, well, growth strategy, creative strategy, paid media, how would I allocate that growth? Right? They're not, you could easily just say, all right, and I'll divide it up by a percentage and call it a day. But I think it really depends on your business and say, all right, well, growth strategy usually contributes to at least 60% of it. So maybe that's what we assign. But you start to, when we talk about this idea of cascading down goals, and that's exactly what we're doing, is that we're taking a macro goal and then breaking it down into more and more manageable pieces until you get down to the individual level.
So I love this. This is super helpful. So that chunking of taking this kind of raw metric and getting it to the allocation of the best contribution for, your area and what you're doing. What strikes me about that is there's an order to it, and it's clear that you can identify, what the revenue people are there for and what, retaining revenue is for. But then you actually get to the actual human beings. So you actually get down to like, okay, so this individual contributor or this manager or this director, and you've been working with them for some amount of time, and maybe they're more junior or they're more senior. How do you begin to kind of parse that out? Or is it just, look, if you're in this role, the goal should match the role, not the person and their capacity at this moment? How do you think about those tensions?
So with a challenge, I would usually take it through the business lens and then the human lens. I think what I would do is to say, okay, the expectation for a director is to have this level of goal setting. So I would actually make that determination absent of that person as a first pass. The second pass, I would say, all right, well, is this director capable of hitting these goals? Do they have the proper knowledge? Do they have the proper information? Do they have the proper responsibility rights? It is my job to remove barriers and provide resources. And so it's not really about, okay, should we come up with a name? Pokemon. But like, can this director meet those standards that we have for directors? And if they cannot, what can we do from an individual coaching perspective in order to help them meet those standards? It's not about dropping the standards to meet the individual.
I love that. And I think it's such perspective to have both lenses of the business priorities. And for shorthand, I think a lot of people can relate to this. It's almost like the income statement view of kind of when we're looking at the people business, right? There's the income statement view of like, what could an individual person contribute to profit or earnings or, reducing expenses or increasing revenue, whatever the pieces within the P&L. That's one lens, but it's not the only lens. And the metaphor that we talked about offline before we chatted today was this idea of looking at the business also through the balance sheet metaphor, where we're thinking about how do we improve the quality of the asset? How do we, and limit its liabilities? So what I'm hearing you say is number one, you get really clear about what the standard is and you name it with absolute clarity that this is the goal to hit. We don't reduce the standard if you come up against someone who's challenged with that. But in the recognition that someone is challenged with that, there's work to be done. That there's something that needs to be built around just the clear dollar metric around what are we doing with the individual to make sure that they're the right person in the right role, doing the right thing at the right time in the right way. And that they're going to be able to help contribute for you as an organization to become the kind of organization that's able to execute for these big metric numbers. Is that one way to frame it or think about it?
Yes. And what I'll add too is that I don't think any of us have met a CEO who gives us a target and we say, hey, we're not going to hit that. And they're like, okay. What they'll say is, okay, based on the current resources, if you cannot hit that target, what is it going to take for you to hit that target? Because the first option is not an option. So that's really what I expect out of my leadership team as well, which is to say, hey, here's the target. Here's the goal that we've set. Here's the rationale behind why we've hit that goal. We really do think it's achievable. Now, I've been a part of organizations where some CEOs will set a target well beyond what they think is possible in order to motivate the team. We're not one of those organizations. And I think there's merit to being both. But if a director or VP comes to me and they say, hey, that target that you're setting forth, like I can't get there based on what I have today. I'm like, okay, well then make the case for what kind of investment we need to make. Is it more training? Is it more people? What does that look like so that you can get there?
That's so helpful. And it's also helpful, again, coming back to the kind of the human lens for a second, every role has a direct contribution to something on the P&L. I know that's a topic that comes up all the time for, business leaders. It's like, how do you justify someone's role and their contribution? And, how are they helping make the business better? Not just in who it is, but in terms of the output that it's able to achieve. And I'm curious how you think about those kinds of goals too, where you have folks that aren't quite as directly connected to the money. How do you think about goals for those folks?
Now that's really difficult because in my previous life, when I was leading innovation, it was very similar, where a lot of what you're trying to achieve is theoretical or based on future potential for the company rather than actual revenue or cost cutting or really tied to dollars. And in our previous conversation, we had talked about this in terms of human resources or finance or, a lot of what are considered overhead teams who don't contribute to actually pulling in revenue. And I think that really breaks down into how I think about goals of the what and the how. And so what are you accomplishing and how are you doing it? We'll say that when you're in a mature enough business, what you're doing is you're also, putting investment in places and creating hypotheses as to, how it's contributing to the business qualitatively and maybe not quantitatively.
You're making bets.
Yeah, absolutely. You're making a bet that it's going to work. And so I don't know if you want to take a specific example in terms of the employee development and performance world, but we've talked about this too, where, I can point and say that from a culture perspective and standard setting, I think we are stronger than we've ever been. And I know that it is based on your team's efforts. Can I tie that back to a revenue amount? I don't think so. Doesn't make it any less valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting to think about even just someone's motivation. So we could spend a whole episode on this in a future day, but the idea of thinking about like what actually motivates people to want to make their highest contribution, to set a standard and to actually go beyond it. And, humans are very complex beings. We're motivated by so many different things, different seasons in our life. Think about like almost like a business, when you're starting out, you're just trying to get a foothold in an industry, in a career, in a company. And you're like, yeah, I'll do anything. You have all this enthusiasm and not much experience. And then over time, that kind of equilibrium shifts and you have more experience than you have enthusiasm necessarily. But how do you maximize those contributions, pulling the levers of, extrinsic motivators, things like, paying people really well, giving them great benefits and attracting them with a cool company, cool brand that you're part of. But then also intrinsic motivators. How do people get better at their job every day? Do they want to get better? Do they want to actually just get a paycheck and quiet quit? Or do they actually want to be contributors and transparently engage in a way where it feels like it's less about self-preservation and more about how do we actually go out on a limb, put ourselves on the hook to actually contribute at the highest and best level. And those are the best companies, right? The ones that figure out that magic wand of motivation for the people that you have because they really want to be a part of the thing that you're building. That takes a tremendous amount of energy and really goes beyond just goal setting in a year and executing, because we're not robots. We're not just, we get this handed down and we go and execute on the thing. We're doing that in the midst of having small kids and having challenges that, beyond the workplace and desires and ambitions and dreams. And in the midst of that, you're also handing out goals and holding people accountable to the promises that they make, coming across individuals who you're not totally sure. You're on the fence. You're like, these are the goals. These are the standards. We don't want to decrease them. We recognize where they're at, and we're trying to figure out if they're all in, if they're wholeheartedly going to execute on this thing. How do you process through that, Orchid, and wrestling with, is the right person up for the goals that are needed for this year for the company?
I feel like we've done a lot of that work this year. And I'll speak to how we look for new candidates and also how we engage with current employees. And I think that we've done a lot of engaging with both through more transparency and honesty. I think one of the things that we do really well is that we're really honest that we're not a place for everybody. And I think that having been both on the agency and brand side, they're very different experiences. An agency side can be really challenging. And I think it was invaluable experience that I had at the beginning of my career. And it means that you are wearing many hats. It means that you probably have many clients. I mean, there used to be things that we would say like, oh, you're only good as your last meeting. But I will say that in that challenging environment, that was where I grew the most. And so I think interviews are a two-way street. We always say this in interviews. And for us, we have to move forward with honesty and goodwill and say, hey, we're not a place for everybody. But if you are looking to be uncomfortable in order to grow and to have a lot of different experiences with a lot of amazing clients, then come here, where other people will also push you to be your best. But you're going to have to want that for yourself as well. And I think that I don't want to say it's a tone shift, but I think it's just that honesty with ourselves of saying that, of having the confidence to say that has actually yielded the people who have come in and said, yes, like sign me up for this. I want to do this. Now, you and I have also talked about, okay, well, anytime you interview someone, you're placing a bet. And so how someone shows up at an interview and when they say, yes, I want to be that person, do they really mean that? Do they mean that for themselves? Or are they actually going to show up every day and be that person? And so we've established 30, 60, 90 day check-ins to make sure that that person is still tracking along with, what they articulated at the beginning. Anything you would add there?
Yes. Well, yeah, the thing that I would add, it has most to do with the attitude of the leaders of the organization. Like, I think it's so tempting, especially in economies that are challenged, to get a little Darwinian, to actually it's so much easier to go, okay, this is the top line goal for the organization. You better execute downstream. It's a tight economy. Either you have it or you don't have it. And to instead live in that tension of, look, we take our goals very, very seriously, but we also look at the individuals who are asked to execute on those goals and treat that as seriously. It requires a high degree of consciousness of like, who are these people and what are they doing and what are they motivated by? And are we willing to have real, honest conversations along the way about those things and not just become kind of cynical or have a caricature of a perspective of what employees do or they do or people are working the system, but instead to go, no, humans are trying to navigate complex lives with a lot going on. And in the midst of that, some of them might be takers, but a lot of people, more than I'm actually surprised to discover, they actually want to do good work. They want to go to work. And even if it's difficult, especially when it's difficult, as long as they believe that they belong to the place and that there's a sense of appreciation for their contribution and they're actually growing in their ability. If I've found that the more that we have been able to lean into the uncomfortable conversations or being clear about, these goals are very ambitious and we're in this together. We're all attached to the same kinds of goals. It's been so rewarding. And I guess that's the part that I've been surprised by is that in this organization and in the few places, because it's not common for organizations to, I think, take their standards as seriously and their people just as seriously and to live in that tension. It's such a special place to be a part of. And that doesn't happen for everybody. I know there's a lot of folks that are listening who are going into a year where maybe they don't have that kind of a culture and they have ambition to get there. Like a year from now, they'd like to be in a place where they're heading down goals and they know their people, they're having hard conversations and they're trying to increase the value of the asset, not just whatever the kind of global goal is for the organization. And maybe this is a good way to end. What advice would you give, Orchid, for aspirational companies, organizations, agencies, brands, whatever, who are looking to get somewhere they're not, and they're getting input like you're sharing, but they're not quite there yet? What attitude should they have going into this year? And how can they create some kind of a minimal viable benchmark starting point that they can grow from effectively?
I'll start, and I say this in the most loving way, but people are messy. And whenever you are making decisions about how a company is going to perform, for now, there are going to be people involved. And I think that there is a type of person who wants all the information to be perfectly set before they make a decision. And my piece of advice would be to take the best information you have at the time and a general direction and go. Now, I know that piece of advice is probably more relevant for smaller companies who are or can be more agile. I think as leadership, that is our job. And it is something that we get to do, which is to pick the most accurate information we have at the time, knowing what our aspirations are for the business, and having a pulse on what our people are capable of, and to connect those dots. You're not going to get it right 100% of the time, but I think the most important thing is to get started. Dane, one thing I did want to cover, if you're open to it, is the tactical piece of checking in on goals. What do you think?
I think that this is a lot of complex conversation that's going to take a lot of time to kind of unfold. And I'm excited that in the days to come, folks find out about this show and have a chance to share with their friends and tune in, that people share with us too about what they think and how what are the felt needs that they're having as they're kind of trying to go after these kinds of endeavors. But make no mistake, friends, this show is about the people business, and it's the tensions of business and people and business. And if we don't figure out how to do this better and better as human beings, we're not going to enjoy our work very much. We might get a paycheck, but it won't be that meaningful in our jobs. And we actually believe that we can have both. We can actually build thriving businesses and thriving people in the same place. But it's not for the faint of heart. It's going to be complex. And we hope that you join us as we wrestle through these issues together.